Welcome to the third event in the Voices of Our Time speaker series for this academic year. Voices of Our Time is designed to bring the world's leading thinkers to campus to discuss important national and international issues. Let me bring to your attention, we will have one more in this series this year. The evening of April 3rd, Stephanie Sinclair and Cynthia Gorney will speak on Too Young to Wed, Uncovering the World of Child Brides in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa. It's April the 3rd. Wake Forest believes that providing access to world-class speakers is part of our students' global education, as well as our commitment to this community. Today we are pleased to welcome Eboo Patel to campus to lead us in a thoughtful discussion on global faith and religious leadership in the 21st century. Dr. Patel is the founder and president of Interfaith Youth Core, a Chicago-based organization building the global interfaith youth movement. He served on President Obama's inaugural advisory council of the White House Office of Faith-Based and Neighborhood Partnerships. The idea of the Interfaith Youth Core began when Eboo participated in an interfaith conference at Stanford University, where he was one of only a few young people at that conference. He wondered then if he could build an interfaith youth movement using service as the bridge. As a graduate student at Oxford University, Eboo was instrumental in organizing youth service projects in South Africa, India, and Sri Lanka. And when he returned to Chicago, he launched the idea in the United States with a focus on student leaders and college campuses. The Interfaith Youth Core seeks to inspire young leaders of different faiths to work together to improve their communities and to serve others. Their work is based on appreciative knowledge of diverse religious traditions and philosophical perspectives, meaningful encounters between people of different faith and philosophical backgrounds, and common action projects between people of different backgrounds. Eboo Patel is the author of Acts of Faith, a book which I highly recommend. His work to build community, tolerance, understanding, and to promote the idea of service through these goals speaks directly to our own alma mater and its mission to serve humanity. We are delighted to have him here today to share his thoughts with us and engage us in discussion on this very important topic. Eboo Patel.
A couple of weeks ago, I was in a coffee shop. I was flipping through the final round of edits on my new manuscript. Somebody stopped by and said, "What's that stack of papers you got?" He said, "It's my new book on interfaith cooperation." He said, "It ought to be a lot shorter than that looks. It ought to be 3 sentences. Religions have always fought. They will always fight. End of story." And then he smiled. And basically, I said nothing. I had no crisp answer. I'm a guy who's done interfaith work for 14 years, been paid to do it for 10, and I had no way of quickly and crisply engaging one of the most common sentiments in our times. Think about that Lupe Fiasco line, "It's so loud in my head with all the words I should have said." So I'm going to share a few with you. I'm going to share the stories that kept me up at night over the last couple weeks, thinking, how would I have shaped these to intervene in that offhand, quick comment that guy made, which, who knows, dominates the mindscapes of 50, 60, 70% of the population. First president of the United States, George Washington, doing his tour around the United States, goes to Newport, Rhode Island. A man at the Hebrew congregation stands up and says, "President Washington, I represent a community that has been hounded and hated for centuries in Europe. We have a new country here in the United States, a new government. You are its president. How will my people be treated here?" George Washington went back to Washington, D.C., And he wrote a letter that became the letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, one of the most important founding documents of this country, in which he told Moses Sessions and the Jews of America that his government would give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance, that the children of the stock of Abraham would be able to sit in safety under their own vine and fig, and there should be none to make them afraid. Fast forward many years, 1893, city of Chicago. A group of the civic leaders in that city decides, as a part of the Columbian Exposition, the World's Fair, to have a parliament of the world's religions. From all over the world, the great masters came. Swami Vivekananda from India, D.T. Suzuki representing Buddhism. And at the end of that several days of remarkable deliberation, the first time in the West that people from different faiths had formally gathered to articulate who they were, what they were about, how their traditions spoke to shared values, Charles Bonney stood up in that hall and used these words: "From now on, the great religions of the world make war no longer on each other, and instead on the giant ills that afflict humankind." Fast forward 70 more years. Again, the city of Chicago, 1963, the Chicago Conference on Religion and Race. One young African-American Baptist preacher comes from the South to bring the thunder that he brings with the Hebrew prophets from Amos: "Let justice rain down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream." And what is special about that audience is there is a man with the long beard sitting in the back of the lecture hall, a man who escaped the trains running from Warsaw to Auschwitz by 6 weeks, who was this close to burning in Hitler's hell camps. When he came to America, if there was one person with the excuse to focus only on himself, only on his own community, given what he had witnessed happen in Europe, it would have been the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And instead, when the civil rights movement began to move, Heschel thought to himself, I have to go do darshan. I have to go have a personal encounter with the man who's leading this. In his journal that night, after hearing King speak, Heschel writes, "The soul of Judaism is at stake in the civil rights movement." There is that famous march, of which there is that iconic picture of Heschel with that bushy beard marching with King in Selma. Heschel says after that, "It felt like my legs were praying." But I understand a situation similar to that took place right here in Winston-Salem, that Heschel and King were here. Go back a couple decades to the site of Hitler's death camps. Young Lutheran minister Dietrich Bonhoeffer took the last ocean liner that went from New York City, where he was teaching at Union Theological Seminary, back to Germany, because he wanted to be a witness to what was happening. And on one particular night of ugliness, when he saw the German shock troops come into Jewish neighborhoods, beat men, intimidate women and children, destroy shops, he got on German radio and he spoke these words: "Those who did not speak up for the Jews do not deserve to sing Gregorian chants." There is a justice requirement which precedes the privilege of worship in Bonhoeffer's version of Christianity. The cost of discipleship for Dietrich Bonhoeffer was standing up for those who were suffering, not in spite of being Christian, but because you were. A delegation of Christians came to visit the Prophet Muhammad in Medina. They came to argue. They came to argue about the nature of Jesus. And the Prophet held firm. Jesus was an embodiment of mercy. He was a messenger of God. He brought the idea of monotheism. We love Jesus as Muslims, but he was not the Son, and we do not view him as the Savior. And the argument was heated, and it went on and on. And when it came time for the Christians to pray, they asked the Prophet if they could have safe leave of the city to go make their prayers outside of Medina, the city of the Prophet. and then return to continue the discussion. And the prophet's response was to open the door to his mosque and say, "Pray here." And they said, "But we've just argued about religion. Why would you let us pray in your mosque?" And the prophet's response was, "Just because we disagree in matters of theology does not mean that I will not extend hospitality to you. That is my commitment to you. That is the partnership between us." I wish I had told just one of those stories in that coffee shop a couple weeks ago. I wish I had it the tips of my fingers. I wish I had it right on my lips. Over and over again, I've let stories like that go by. I've let other people dominate reality. I've let other people say that in the DNA of religion is a desire to fight. I've let other people say that what religions do when they come into close quarters with each other is kill each other. And that's simply not true. But we're only as loud as the noises we make. That's Ani DeFranco, by the way. And so if we don't articulate loudly a different version of what it means for people from different religions to live in close quarters with each other, we let the clash of civilizations version, we let the religion poisons everything version, we let the Muslims are coming to get you version win. There's this beautiful vignette in Italo Calvino's book, Invisible Cities. The trope of the book is Marco Polo traveling around the empire of Kublai Khan and returning to the emperor's feet and telling the emperor about all of the cities in that empire. And of course, you find out towards the end that the only city he's talking about over and over again in these different vignettes is Venice. It's just different takes on Venice. And towards the end of that book, there's this vignette about a bridge. And Marco Polo tells Kublai Khan about this beautiful bridge. And Kublai Khan at one point gets a bit too smart for his own bridges, and he says to the great traveler, he says, "Tell me about the stone that holds the bridge together." Marco Polo says, "The bridge isn't held together by a stone. It's held together by an arch." Kublai Khan says, "Then why are you speaking of stones? Tell me about the arch." And Marco Polo says, "Your Eminence, without stones, there is no arch." I love that story because it reminds me of how intricate it is, how challenging it is to build a bridge. There's actually a lot of other things you can do with stones. And if you think about stones as religious identities, you can take stones and make of them a bunker. And you can bunker yourself off from the rest of the world. And you can say, my religion has nothing to do with what's going on out there. We're just too pure for the world. You can take stones and you can make of them a barrier. And you can call other people's theologies phony. And you can stand up at pulpits and say, let me tell you all the reasons they are wrong and bad and evil. Barriers of division. You can take of stones and make of them bludgeons or bombs. If you read the New York Times today or any international newspaper, I promise you, you'll find 6 stories, at least 6, of people making of faith a bludgeon or a bomb. People dying around the world to the soundtrack of prayer. But to make of it a bridge, what does that take? To put stones together in a way that takes us from one bank, a bank of division, a bank of prejudice, a bank of ignorance, a bank of distrust, cross to the other side, which is a different bank. A bank that King called the beloved community, and to form a bridge that actually holds together, that has that arch of pluralism. What does that take? I've been thinking about this for 10 long years. What does it take to build the bridge of pluralism? And actually, remarkably, the answer is simple. It comes out of this insight, that bridges don't fall from the sky. They don't rise from the ground. There's one thing outside of raw materials you need to build a bridge. That's a bridge builder. You need somebody who's going to do it. Makes me think about my silence, my ineffectiveness in the cafe. It's not like there was going to be a voice booming from the sky that told that guy he was wrong, that told that guy religions don't always fight. I was going to have to do it. And I didn't. I failed in that moment. If we're going to make of diverse religious identities bridges, if we're going to build something that helps people get from where we are to the other side, we're going to need bridge builders. It's one of the reasons that I like the plural part of the title of this series, the voices part. I happen to be at the microphone, but the S on voices, the voices, they're us. They're you. We're the bridge builders. Who else is going to do it? Except for the people who believe in this vision, who see the other side. There's this moment in the life of Martin Luther King Jr., which just I feel like inspires me more and more each time I think about it. Folks have heard the line, the beloved community, right? You know the moment that comes from? It's at the end of the bus boycott, 1956. You know, the way we're taught about the Montgomery bus boycott in high school is Rosa Parks refused to go to the back of the bus. Martin Luther King was a hero. People walked to work for a couple days. They got to sit where they wanted to on the bus. Then there was the March on Washington. Then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1965. And now there's a lot of, and then there was the Cosby Show, right? That's the history of civil rights. It's 380 days long. 380 days long. People walked in Montgomery. There's this moment where King is getting up at a church to speak, and Ralph Abernathy approaches him before he begins, and he says, "Martin, your house has been firebombed." And King asks, "Is Coretta okay? Is the baby okay? They had a new baby." And Ralph Abernathy has to say, "We don't know." It's a time when King was driving 10 miles an hour below the speed limit because they would pull you over if you were driving 1 mile an hour above, being as careful as could be. Got pulled over anyway, thrown in the back of the police car, driven to the outskirts of town, through the woods, and thinking to himself, this is it. People with my skin color don't return from the back of police cars in 1956 when they're driven to the outskirts of town in Montgomery, Alabama at night. Which makes where the beloved community comes from all that more important, all that more striking. It's towards the end of this time when there's actually been a court order that comes down which requires the buses to integrate. And a journalist asks King, says to him, "You know, Reverend King, think about all that's been sacrificed. Think about the false arrests, think about the fire bombings, think about the suicides," and there were a couple because it just got too hard for some folks. "And think about what you won. You won the right to sit front to back in the buses of one provincial city in America. That's it. Aren't you angry? I mean, doesn't the victory raise your frustration even more, considering how small it is and everything you had to go through?" And this is King's response. This isn't the time for anger. This is the time for redemption. This is the time for reconciliation. This is the time to build the beloved community. That's the other side. And what we need is a group of people who not only believe that that exists, that not only believe we're going to get there, but are able to build the bridge and able to lead the flock. And the more I think about it, the more it seems to me it takes three basic things to be an interfaith leader, to be a bridge builder. Part one is so simple. It's a framework. It's the right framework. It's the right vision. There's this beautiful line in the work of Marcel Proust that the true journey of discovery is not in seeing new landscapes. It's in developing new eyes. What does it take to have new eyes on the great religious division issues of our times? I think that folks in Winston-Salem might get this faster than folks elsewhere, because it was here that the first Woolworth's counter sit-ins took place. Am I right about that? Students from Wake Forest, students from Winston-Salem State University, black students and white students who made the drive. Greensboro is a suburb of Winston-Salem, right? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I said that from my friend, Reverend David Fracaro, who now lives in Greensboro. The reason I think that that illustrates a vision is because 100 years ago, 1906, 1907, W.E.B. Du Bois writes a book called The Souls of Black Folks, and one of the things in the introduction to that book is a line. It says that the problem of the 20th century will be the problem of the color line. And for a long time, people viewed the color line as something that separated white folks and black folks, yellow folks and red folks. But not college students here 50 years ago. They viewed the color line as something that viewed, in King's language, people who want to live as brothers and people who want to perish as fools. So it wasn't white folks over here at the Woolworth's counter, black folks over there when the students went. It was, we want to live in an America that believes that racial division is about those who want to build a society where their race dominates and those who want to build a society where everyone cooperates. That's the division. That's who the color line divides. What if we were to take that same view into the faith line? Faith line doesn't divide Muslims and Christians. It doesn't divide believers and non-believers. The faith line divides those who believe in pluralism from those who believe in totalitarianism. And the definitions of these are so simple. If you want to build a society where people from different backgrounds live in equal dignity and mutual loyalty, we are on the same side of the faith line. I don't care if you pray in Arabic or Hebrew or Latin or Greek or English or not at all. If you view America as a place where people from different identity backgrounds have dignity, where they have relationships, where they work together for the common good, we are on the same side of the faith line. The other side, totalitarians. If you are one of the very, very small group of people who believes that only your faith should dominate and everyone else should suffocate, you are on the other side of the faith line. And I don't care if you pray in Hebrew or in Latin or in Greek or in Sanskrit or in Pali or in Arabic or not at all. If you want your group to dominate and everyone to suffocate, you're on the other side of the faith line. The first thing that interfaith bridge builders have to do is to get the faith line right, to get the worldview right, and to recognize that an awful lot of what we hear about religion is people getting the faith line wrong. People talking about a Muslim versus Christian world, or a believer versus non-believer world, or an America versus Arab world, instead of a pluralism versus totalitarianism world. Max Dupre says very simply, leaders define reality. What does it make to define reality as a nation or a world where people from different religions cooperate and work together, and part of what they're working against is the totalitarian instinct in the small group of people on the other side of the faith line? That's part one of being an interfaith bridge builder. Part two is a knowledge base. It's something we call interfaith literacy at the Interfaith Youth Core. It's got several parts. I want to just give you two. One part is an appreciative knowledge of other people's traditions. What does it mean to admire something about another religion? And I want to tell this to you in the form of a story. So I was in Australia a couple years ago at an interfaith conference, a conference about Muslim minorities in Australia. And the conference took place in the Houses of Parliament, and there were television cameras whirring. And I thought to myself, okay, television cameras don't come to interfaith conferences unless there's an interfaith cage match. And sure enough, there was an interfaith cage match. And they had effectively taken the angriest looking Christian figure they could find and the angriest looking Muslim figure they could find, put them on a stage together and said, tell this audience what you hate about the other person's religion. It was a classic example of a Muslim versus Christian faith line. Let me tell you something. The angriest looking figure in the world of Islam will always beat the angriest looking figure and my guy was like 6'5", wearing a tattered robe with a staff, missing half his teeth. Looked like he had walked out of a 12th century cave. And I'm like, we just lost. Christian guy goes first. And he turns to the imam on the stage and he says, I grew up in Pakistan. Not once in my whole time in Pakistan, until I was in my early 20s and I finally fled, did I ever have a positive interaction with a Muslim. You Muslims burned down my church. You Muslims harassed my wife. You Muslims wouldn't let my children get an education. You Muslims called us heretics. We couldn't eat with you. We couldn't sit with you. And finally, I fled. And I said a prayer on the plane, a prayer of gratitude that you Muslims in Pakistan weren't following every tenet of your Prophet Muhammad, because if you had, you would have killed us. I'm the interfaith guy. I'm supposed to remain calm. I play the Muslim Mr. Rogers on TV. I help people be comfortable. You play that too, Imam Griggs. You know exactly what I'm talking about. I help people become comfortable with 1.5 billion of their fellow world citizens. I am not feeling calm at this moment. There is sweat gathering on my forehead. There are hairs rising on the back of my neck. I am thrilled that my guy has stained teeth. I am thrilled that my guy is carrying a staff. My guy turns to the Christian and he says, in the gentlest tone that I can describe, I think what I am expected to do now is to tell you that I hate your religion. But I don't. I love Jesus. In Islam, he's a prophet. He's a messenger. He's an embodiment of our most important value, mercy. And I only wish that I had been in the Pakistani village where you grew up, because I would have protected you. That's what Muslims are supposed to do. And that whole room changed, because what this guy had done is he had told an audience in this man really simple stuff. He told them what he admired about Christianity. Now, of course, the way that the scene unfolded, it seems really hard to have done that. But what's remarkable is what this guy did is not respond to the hateful rhetoric of his fellow panelist. What he responded was to a cosmic directive of what it meant to be Muslim, and his understanding of that was articulating admiration and appreciation of other religions. Mustafa said this earlier today, that in a meeting that we had with mostly Muslim students on this campus, that yes, Muslims are going to be approached negatively in this day and age, and we are required Islamically to respond gently, respond with admiration and appreciation. A huge part of interfaith literacy is knowing what we appreciate and admire about other religions. I think to myself, there's a study done by Pew or Gallup a few years ago, and it showed that what Americans reported they knew about Islam and Buddhism was relatively the same. It was basically low. We don't know that much about these religions. But the attitudes that people had about Buddhism were really positive. The attitudes that people had about Islam were really negative. And it took me a while to figure this out. And then finally it clicked. It's actually kind of simple. If people know one thing about Buddhism, if they associate a single person or figure with Buddhism, who is that? Probably the Dalai Lama. I mean, you can't buy that PR, right? For real. I mean, that dude was in an Apple ad. Right? You can't buy other people having only the single most positive image about your religion. And if people know one thing about Islam, or they associate a single figure with Islam, who is it? If that's the only thing you know about a religion that's 1,400 years old, that's 1.5 billion people, I get that your perspective is negative. Remember that guy during the Ground Zero Mosque controversy who carried that sign, "All I need to know about Islam I learned on 9/11"? Do you remember that? I want to thank him for his honesty. And I'm being totally serious, because part of what he did was teach me a really important lesson, which is what people know about another religion, whatever piece that might be, it dramatically impacts their attitudes towards that entire tradition and community. So as interfaith bridge builders, not only is it important to get the framework right, to get the Muslim versus Christian isn't the right framework, it's pluralism versus totalitarianism, it's important to have some appreciative knowledge of those other traditions. So when people say, well, Jews are like this, and it's negative, you can say, you know what? One of the people I admire most in American history is the Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. One of the most beautiful services I've been to is a Shabbat service. You have that appreciative knowledge. Part 2 of a knowledge base is something I spoke about with the Divinity School students this afternoon. It was a terrific conversation. Thank you for letting me be a part of it. We at the Interfaith Youth Core call this a theology of interfaith cooperation. I want to tell you 2 stories to illustrate this. It's a simple concept, right? And the concept is this: what is it from your religion that would inspire you to be a bridge builder? Why is it a Christian thing to do? Show me chapter and verse. Show me hero and story, not in a proof text way, but in a way that is the arch of your tradition, that the arch of Christianity tends in this direction. There's this beautiful little story where this American pastor stationed in Europe during the Holocaust, and his congregation sends him money so that he can come back and celebrate Christmas with his home congregation. And he uses that money to help a group of Jews escape Hitler's hell camps and go to safety. And one of his congregants gets angry about this. And she writes him a letter and says, how could you use that money to help people who weren't even Christian? Pastor writes back a letter with 3 words: because I am. He didn't say, well, the nice thing to do was to help these people. He didn't say, well, I didn't really inquire about their religion. I hoped that they were Christian. He said, part of what we do as Christians is help people from other faiths who are suffering. My friend April Kunze Mendez, who helped start the Interfaith Youth Core 10 years ago, has a story along these lines. I shared it with the Wake Forest Divinity School students this afternoon. She grew up in the church, a deeply believing, devout, practicing Christian. When I say that, I mean that she learned a language so that she could do a mission trip to Russia. Went to Kenya on a summer-long mission trip. If there was going to be one person turning out the church lights late on a weeknight, it was April Kunze. And when she went to Carleton College, she led the Christian group there. And because she was the leader of that group, she was on a listserv of all the religious leaders across the state of Minnesota in the mid-1990s. So when a mosque got attacked in an arson incident, a hate crime, she was the one at Carleton who got the email that said, will you come to a candlelight vigil speaking out against religious hate crimes? And April, from the depths of her bones, sent back a simple email: yes. And when she went to her group that afternoon, and she said, we are going to be going to this candlelight vigil to witness against an arson attack against a house of worship. People were excited. And as the story went along, people learned that it was an imam who sent out that email. And then people put two and two together and discovered it was a mosque that was attacked. And then somebody said, well, maybe this is an opportunity. Maybe it's part of God's plan. Maybe that mosque got burned down so we could bring those people to the true religion, Christianity. Maybe we shouldn't be going to the candlelight vigil. Maybe we should be telling them that if they hadn't worshiped a false god, they wouldn't have had their mosque burned down. April tried to argue against that. Somebody stood up and said, I think you are trying to get us Christians to support devil worship. And then he pulled out his Bible. And then he quoted chapter and verse. I don't know which chapters and which verses. All I know is that April told me a lot of heads in that room started to nod. April had an ultimatum. Either you can remain the head of this Christian student group, or you can go to the mosque. April went to the mosque. This is not a happy story. April stopped being Christian for several years because the people who owned that term on campus were the people who said, when a mosque gets burned down, we cheer. The people who went to the mosque were called nice, not Christian. And as April told me this story, the single most powerful insight she had in the process was this: Eboo, I knew the Bible a lot better than those other people. I knew it backwards and forwards. I knew it in Russian. How did I let them out-scripture me? Why is it that they had at the tip of their tongue a theology of religious domination? Why didn't I have at the tip of mine a theology of interfaith cooperation? Yes, I asked, why didn't you? Well, Eboo, assume this happened in your Muslim community, and it was a church that got burned down. What would your theology of interfaith cooperation be? And then I was silent, because she was exactly right. That situation in reverse could happen, does happen, all the time. Which is to say that every religious community has an experience of watching another community suffer and thinking that perhaps it is part of their theology to cheer that suffering. And she was also right. Eboo Patel, interfaith leader, had no answer to the question of theology. No answer to the question, what does it mean to articulate how Islam inspires you to be an interfaith bridge builder? It's not just a good civic thing to do. It's not just a nice thing to do. It is a Muslim thing to do. It is a Muslim requirement. And so I studied. What else is there to do when you're silent? But go back and read and learn. And there is the story in Islam that I want to share with you. In the year 610, when a merchant named Muhammad took his annual pilgrimage to the cave on Mount Hira, and he gave alms, and he fasted, and he prayed, one of the odd nights of the last 10 days of that month of Ramadan, we Muslims believe, the Archangel Gabriel descended from the heavens, gripped Muhammad, and said 3 times the word Iqra, recite. And on the 3rd time, Muhammad, the Prophet Muhammad, feels the first words of the Quran pour from his lips. Recite in the name of your Lord who created humankind from a clot of blood. There are traditions in Islam which say that Muhammad was scared, didn't quite know what had happened to him, thought the worst, that perhaps demons had possessed him. He went to the person he trusted most in the world, Khadija, his wife. He told her the story. She also didn't know what had happened to him, but she felt sure about one thing. It wasn't demons. Muhammad was too righteous a man, too good a man for God to let something bad happen. Khadija thought and thought and thought and finally said, I'll never figure this out, but there is one person I know who will tell us. It is my cousin, Waraka, a man who is learned in the scriptures. I will bring you to him. Khadija brings her husband, Muhammad, to Waraka, and he sits in his robes and he listens to the story. And he looks in Muhammad's eyes and he kisses him on the forehead and he says, verily, the prophet of your people has arrived. Who was Waraka? What does it mean to be learned in the scriptures in the 7th century in the western half of the Arabian Peninsula? Waraka was a Christian. The first person to recognize the prophethood of Muhammad was a Christian. Muhammad never asks him to convert. Waraka never converts. Deep in Islam is this call to interfaith cooperation, is this requirement to have respect, reverence for people from another faith, for they might see things that we don't. They might recognize deep things about us, our religions, that we don't recognize ourselves. There is ayah after ayah, story after story. There's this beautiful line that God made people, different nations and tribes, that we may come to know one another. But it's that story of Waraka, that notion that at the very founding of my faith is the idea of being an interfaith bridge builder. That, for me, is what will stay with me for the rest of my life. What about you? If you were in April's position, you wanted to go be a positive witness to another religious community that had suffered, and you were challenged, and somebody brought out the texts and the hermeneutics and the stories of why you ought to be happy when another religion suffers. What do you say? What's your theology of interfaith cooperation? Listen, this interfaith thing is never going to go from niche to norm. It's never going to start defining reality in this, the most religiously diverse country in human history, the most religiously devout country in the West, unless people are convinced that it is a Christian thing to do, or a Jewish thing to do, or a Muslim thing to do. All those stones that we lay together, all those wonderful words we use, social capital, social cohesion, all the civics, it's not enough for the arch of pluralism. This has to also be a theological thing to do. And we have to be the ones articulating that theology. Part 3, final part, skill set. You know, my friend Melissa Rogers is here, who's faculty at the Divinity School and lives in DC. And we were in the Oval Office in March of 2009, listening to President Obama tell the Faith Council, of which we were some of the inaugural members, what he expected of us. I remember the president ticking through 4 things pretty quickly, pretty businesslike. Number 1, in this time of recession, American hurt, faith communities have to be involved in service like never before. Number 2, we ought to be doing that service together. We ought to be bridging and multiplying our social capital. Number 3, that ought to be an example to the world. Read the newspapers. It's not the way that people from different religions always get along elsewhere. Some of the big questions around the Arab Spring are going to be, how are Muslims and Christians going to build an Egypt together? How are Sunnis and Shias going to build a Bahrain together? The interfaith cooperation in America ought to be a model for the world. And finally, young people ought to be in leadership around this. My friend and mentor, Jim Wallace, was standing next to me, and he elbowed me in the ribs, and he said, "It sounds to me like the president is talking about what you're doing at the Interfaith Youth Core." It sounded an awful lot like that to me, too. And I raised my hand and I said, "Mr. President, that's exactly what we're trying to do, and we want to work with you to make that happen." And he smiled and he said, "We'll get back to you on that." And every bit of that sounded genuine to me. Actually, walking out with my friend Joshua Dubois, who is the executive director of the President's Faith Office, I was like, "Where did that come from?" And Joshua was like, "Was not in my briefing to him." Surprised Joshua as much as anybody else. I went back to the President's first book, Dreams from My Father. You read the Chicago chapter of that book. What was Barack Obama doing in his early 20s in Chicago in the mid-1980s? The language we have is that he was a community organizer. Well, which communities was he working with? What was he organizing? He was working with Protestant and Catholic churches and Muslim groups to start tutoring programs, job training initiatives, environmental cleanups on the south side of Chicago. Barack Obama was an interfaith leader. Part of what brought him to Trinity United Church of Christ was an articulation of a theology of interfaith cooperation in that church. Barack Obama knew what it meant to be a young person putting the skills of interfaith literacy into practice, mobilizing folks from different backgrounds, facilitating conversations between different religions on shared values. On my way to Wake Forest this morning, I was thinking to myself, there's another 20-something that I know who learned a little bit about interfaith cooperation on this campus, who would go to a meeting of the Muslim Students Association at 6 o'clock, go to a meeting of the Interfaith Council at 7:30, think to himself, wait a second, we're both talking about the importance of service, shoot off an email to the chaplain at 9:30 at night and say, can we talk about doing some interfaith projects together? And when Mustafa Abdullah graduates from Wake Forest, he takes that skill set, that framework, that knowledge base into Winston-Salem. And he starts building bridges between the Muslim groups and the Protestant groups and the Jewish groups and the Catholic groups and the humanist groups in this city. And part of what I think is so exciting about this notion of interfaith cooperation on college campuses is, what if America's 3,000 campuses, which all value this notion of respect for identity, bridges between communities, young people's leadership in building those bridges, an articulation of a beloved community, leading folks from where we are across that bridge of pluralism to the other side. What if America's 3,000 campuses decide they wanted to be models of this? They wanted to be models of interfaith cooperation, little mini ecologies that said part of what America is about, part of what Stanford and Vanderbilt and Wake Forest is about, is our students value that George Washington said to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, that this country would give bigotry no sanction and persecution no assistance. Our students value that the first major interfaith event in the West took place on these shores. Our students value that an Eastern European Hasidic rabbi got caught up in the interfaith movement and connected the soul of Judaism to that. That we become ecologies that nurture a generation of interfaith leaders, folks that go out into their communities, their neighborhoods, their companies. They build these bridges. They facilitate these conversations. They mobilize to that other side. That's what I think America is about. That's what I think college is about. You know, one of my favorite memories is my 3-year-old son, Zaid, on stage at St. Matthias Catholic School on the north side of Chicago in his little Santa hat, talking to his friend Lisa, who's from China. Mom's Caucasian, aunt is Pakistani. and they start in on the song together. Miss G throws down the signal, and it's a little wobbly at first. They're 3 years old, but they get the swing of it, and I can't help myself. I start singing along, you know, because I'm thinking about my first time in a redwood forest, just how sacred it felt to be below those towering trees. I'm thinking about my first time hailing a cab on the New York Island, how overwhelming it felt, and how I felt like the world was all there within 6 blocks. My first time seeing the Gulf Stream waters. I thought, you know, one day my kid will know what it means that this land belongs to him, that people have worked long and hard to make it a nation where we have the best chance for God's diverse people to come to know one another. He'll know what that means. And he'll know what it means to share it with Lisa and with Mox and with Simon, the 310 million of us, right? The most religiously diverse human community ever gathered in a single political entity. We share it together, and we make it sacred by how we welcome the contributions of different people, how we form relationships between them. We make it sacred by the bridges we build. I want to leave you with the line. It's from Gwendolyn Brooks. It's outside of Chicago, one of Obama's favorite poets. We are each other's business. We are each other's harvest. We are each other's magnitude and bond. Thank you. We've got 10 students who are supposed to ask questions, and I have talked way too long. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Why don't we take these 3 at a time, so we make sure we get through all 10, and I will try to weave together themes.
My question is with...
Tell us your name. I know your name, but tell the rest of the folks.
My name is Mohammed Siddiqui. I want to talk about this theology of interfaith cooperation. You talk about the case of April. Now, it seems that on one side, you want to engage someone hermeneutically, sort of ask, well, what compels you, right? What is it about your faith that brings you to this, that makes you want to be in relationship with other people? And then talk about hermeneutics from there. And then you talk about another approach on the other side of this, that is having language ready, having answers ready that are already interfaith in their nature, that are also authentic to your tradition. Now, I just want to know, how do you navigate that equilibrium between the two? Mm-hmm. When is it right to use either approach?
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. I should have known better than to let you ask me the first question. It was going to be hard, right?
My name is Paulo Guazzini, and you mentioned Du Bois' Souls of Black Folk. In there, he talks about the double consciousness, which is a struggle that African Americans at that time were dealing with. Do you, as a Muslim American today, feel the same struggle? And if so, how would you fix this for future generations?
Terrific question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Danielle Gallant, and you spoke a lot about community service and community engagement through interfaith cooperation. And so my question was just, most of the service work that you mentioned was social justice based. So my question is kind of relating to the Wake Forest service trip to Calcutta, where there's you experience a lot of religious intensity from a lot of different faiths, mainly Catholicism, Hinduism, and Islam. So I kind of wanted to relate that to communities like Winston-Salem and ask you how interfaith cooperation can intersect more with human service type volunteer work, and if it's something that social justice has to happen before to allow the collaboration. Like, do you need social justice to bring together different religions so that community development can happen together, or is that something that, is it a more fluid relationship?
Terrific question. All of these are terrific questions, and all of them are very, very hard questions. I'm going to start with Muhammad's question, which is, I think that having a theology of interfaith cooperation is having a sophisticated understanding of how your religion inspires you to build bridges with other people, right? And if you were to write it all out, it could take 200 pages. And when you're in the coffee shop with somebody who says religions will always fight, what you have to do is give them a story of your theology of interfaith cooperation that helps them think differently. So you can't give them all 200 pages. That's part of the reality of the world. It's part of what we teach new staff people at the Interfaith Youth Core, many of whom come out of excellent schools like Wake Forest and have done master's degrees and written 100-page theses. We say, do not write anything longer than 2 pages at this organization. Part of what we do, that doesn't mean what we do isn't sophisticated. It means that you have articulated in long form an entire understanding of something. We now need to learn how to articulate the short form of that so that we can change conversations in a world that engages in the short form, right? So when I'm on CNN, it's 12 seconds. That's what I get. And either I can complain about that and say, well, I'm too smart to fit everything into 12 seconds, or I can figure out how to say what I need to say in 12 seconds. It's based off of a 200-page thesis that I did at Oxford. It's based off of 10 years of intellectual work at the Interfaith Youth Core. But if I can't say it in 12 seconds when I only have 12 seconds, I just lose. It's that simple. I lose, right? So having the long-form understanding and then the short-form articulations for the right formats, I think, is the way to go. And then being able to move back and forth between those things, I think that's what I call the craft of interfaith cooperation, right? And it's part of what we've done all day. And Muhammad, you have spent an awful lot of the day with me, right? And part of what you have seen is how do you tell stories compellingly in different contexts and formats, right? How are people telling different stories? What's the right story to tell when? How do you string stories together, right? So I think, to repeat again, the long-form articulation of the theology is sophisticated and it's intricate, and then the short-form intervention has to be contextual, and it just has to be at the tip of your tongue or you lose, right? I imagine we'll continue talking about this, Muhammad. I imagine you and I are going to know each other for some time. Double consciousness. I think that's a terrific question. I have a couple of responses to that. So one of the things that Du Bois says about double consciousness is that he opens the book with the question, how does it feel to be a problem? Okay? And a big part of the double consciousness comes as a result of feeling like a problem. Not the only part, because I think that a lot of minority groups in America, whether or not they feel like a problem, feel like they have double consciousness, right? They're navigating multiple worlds. They're speaking Arabic or Spanish or French at home. They have a certain way of getting along at home and an entirely different way of getting along outside. And part of what they're navigating, for example, my nanima was nanima at home. And when we were at school, do you think I would have been caught dead as a 13-year-old brown kid in the white western suburbs of Chicago saying the word nanima? She was grandma. I knew I was navigating double consciousness, right? And I knew that part of it was because I felt like a problem. So one interesting, so I think that exists to a certain extent. There's no doubt about that. I think that there's an interesting paradigm shift that we have an opportunity to do. And I'm not saying this is easy, okay? It's something that has been taught to me by my spiritual teachers, and I talked about this with the Muslim group earlier today, especially Sheikh Hamza Youssef, who in the middle of a really ugly moment of religious prejudice against Muslims in America 18 months ago during the Ground Zero mosque crisis, as I was boo-hooing, feeling like a victim, he was basically like, you're getting this wrong, man. you have a chance to be part of the solution like never before. His line was, our nation is molten and can be shaped. This is the moment you've been dreaming for. You finally get to have the conversation of what America's religious diversity means. Yes, you're having the conversation uphill, but at least there's a hill. 2 months ago, there was no hill. Nobody wanted to have the conversation, right? So a piece of this is, what does it mean to view oneself as a solution because there is a crisis around your community? That's a dramatic paradigm shift to make, but precisely because Muslims are in a position where an awful lot of prejudice is directed against them, we have a different type of opportunity, a heightened opportunity, and I think a heightened responsibility to articulate in America where everybody contributes. And people will listen to us in ways where they might not have listened to us before. That's where I think the double consciousness moves from a mutually exclusive double consciousness, which is how I used to feel. You know, I couldn't have Islam, America, and India in my system all at the same time. I had to be one or another, to what we at the Interfaith Youth Core call mutually enriching, which is, how do you understand the relationships between these traditions, right? And that's one of the things I think that King does beautifully. He articulates the African American tradition as something that's distinct, but is a contributing element to America. And you go back to one of his sermons, he has this whole list of great African American achievements. George Washington Carver's science achievements, Jesse Owens' athletic achievements, the artistic achievements of great African American artists. And part of what he's saying is, yes, we are a distinct tradition and we're a river flowing into the ocean called America. It's mutually enriching, right? Does this solve everything? No. You know, but I do think it's useful to think about traditions as distinct but mutually enriching, so to speak. You had a terrific question as well. So I think that there are multiple dimensions to your question. There's the question of service, community development, and justice. There's the question of how religious diversity gathers around each of those. There's the question of, is there a theology of each of those? I think all of those are hugely important things, right? My friend David Fricaro in the back, he used to work with us at the Interfaith Youth Core. Gosh, do we miss him? He's doing a lot of what he would likely call social justice work around immigration in North Carolina, working with people from different religious communities to have a just immigration policy. I imagine there's an awful lot of theology that goes in that. There are theologies of welcome, right? I think that that's powerful. I also think that it's useful to recognize that people have different definitions of justice. And that makes this all the more powerful. It just doesn't make it easy. It doesn't mean it's not important. It's just challenging. I'm going to give you an example of this, right? I come from a largely politically progressive background, and there was a very articulate justification for why the war against Iraq in the early 2000s was not a just war. I imagine other people remember that discussion, and it was compelling. And then I remembered that 40 or 50% of Iraq under Saddam was Shia. And I wondered, did they think it was a just war? And could there in fact be two different and still compelling definitions of justice, depending on, frankly, whether your people were being gassed or not? And could those, in a reasonable world, split people of quote-unquote good faith, right? People whose justifications I would both likely agree with, again, depending on whether you were being gassed or not. My answer to that would be yes. That doesn't mean that interfaith social justice work shouldn't be done. It just means, as David and others well know, it has to be done very intricately, right? I want to give one more example along these lines. One of my favorite organizations is Habitat for Humanity. And people view Habitat for Humanity as a service organization, but that's not how Millard Fuller founded it. Millard Fuller founded it as an ecumenical organization. What he cared about most was not necessarily houses getting built. He cared about that, but he cared about most people from different Christian backgrounds who wouldn't talk to each other about Jesus because they had such different views, but who would work together. He called it the theology of the hammer. And his big idea was, if you could get a Presbyterian and a Pentecostal to just build a house together, and if they could just focus on why, as Christians, they were inspired by Jesus to build a house, you would strengthen Christianity. Because then people with very different theologies of Jesus' Christology, for example, would be engaged in a service activity together and have a different theological conversation. I consider that very useful as well. This is all to say, it's a long-winded way of saying, I think these three things, interfaith work around service, community development, and justice, are probably three different things with overlaps, each of which have their costs and benefits, each of which have their own intricacies, and in some ways, you choose which ones you want to do. I know that's only half an answer, and it's not that fulfilling. It's not that fulfilling for me either, but sometimes that's just reality, I think. Next three.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Amy Lang, and I hold a leadership position. So this has to do with community service as well. And I hold a leadership position in Volunteer Service Corps, which is kind of like the umbrella service organization on campus. And one of my duties, I suppose, is to facilitate interfaith service on campus between different campus faith groups. And it's a new position, and it started this year. And so I had to go through and contact every one of the faith groups and ask if they'd be willing to participate in interfaith service. And I got overwhelmingly enthusiastic replies, and it was really heartening. Everybody was really excited to do this. But then I started contacting organizations in the communities, like nonprofits, and to find different venues for these faith groups to serve together. And that's where I kind of hit obstacles. Because a lot of the nonprofits and such were founded on Christian values, say. And they would say things like, Muslims would feel ostracized if they served with us because we pray openly before we serve and stuff like that. And so I was wondering, so I guess my question is, how do you facilitate interfaith discussion and service from that front?
So let me make sure I'm getting this right. How do you facilitate interfaith discussion and service from the perspective, are you asking how do we get a good service project? Or are you asking, how do I have a conversation with the leader of X-Christian nonprofit?
I think it's the latter. I think I had the same kind of cafe moment that you were talking about. I didn't really know how to respond to that.
I have those 6 times a day and I do this for a living, so yeah, I think that's a terrific question. I'm glad I have a few. Part of the trick of getting 3 people to ask questions is I get to think for a couple minutes about your question. It's
okay. My name is Putri Powell, and this question is going off with the story that you told earlier today regarding Imam Faisal, who you said was a liberal imam that wanted to establish an Islamic community center near the ground zero. And he was liberal, you said, but he was still prosecuted by the American mass media as being an extremist. So how should Muslims in the United States, like myself, engage in interfaith dialogue, being true to my own faith, while not being seen as and presenting ourselves as extremists in a society that often views us as such?
Great, thank you for that.
Hi, my name is Ruby Menankera. My question has to do with the United States interfaith cooperation and global affairs. How can interfaith cooperation and interactions strengthen the United States and global affairs when there's a strong need to separate church and state?
So connect for me the church and state part and the global affairs part.
It's relating to how our founding fathers found the Constitution and wanted the separation of church and state, and yet here we are years later, and there's a strong interaction in basing our political decisions on the religious backgrounds of our founding leaders.
There's a strong, sorry, say that last part again.
There's a strong connection with our political views as being connected to our religious values.
You mean in the case of certain individual politicians?
in the case of the United States, is always being seen as this Christian nation.
Right. Okay. In the eyes of much of the world is what you're saying. Right. Okay. All terrific questions. All very hard questions. So Ruby, I'm gonna start with yours. And there's a great line by the British writer G.K. Chesterton that America is a nation with the soul of a church, right? And we are, by orders of magnitude, the most religious nation by any measure in the West, meaning percentage of people who believe in God, percentage of people who go to church, percentage of people who say they pray more than once a day, percentage of people who say religion is very important in their lives, right? So that is actually, that cuts many ways, but one of the ways that cuts is that it's a big part of our public discourse, including our political discourse, right? So you have presidential candidates telling their faith stories as to, and relating it to not only their policy positions, but why they want to run for president. Frankly, that makes an awful lot of sense to me. And here's why it makes sense to me. Because part of the definition of democracy is people bring what's important to them into the public and political arena. And what's important to an awful lot of people in a very devout country is their religion. So why wouldn't we expect it to make up an important part of Mitt Romney's presidential candidacy narrative, or Barack Obama's, or Rick Santorum's, or Newt Gingrich's, right? That actually makes an awful lot of sense to me. And I think that there is a difference between religion in the public square or in public discourse and the separation of church and state. And those are things that the line is fine and the areas are gray, and it's being hashed out all the time. And frankly, this is as interesting an era to live in around this as ever, right? Can the U.S. government tell Catholic institutions what kind of healthcare plans to have? Right? That's a fascinating question, and there are church-state dimensions to that. I happen to have one of America's experts on this in the room and at this university, who's Melissa Rogers, so I hope you take a class from Professor Rogers. I hope you read her work on this. She's a lot smarter than me and just about anybody else I know in this country on that topic. The area that I do want to say one more thing about is, I think precisely because, and Robert Putnam, who's probably America's most influential sociologist, just wrote a book on this with David Campbell at Notre Dame University, who President Hatch knows because that's where he was provost recently. They say at the end of that book, it's actually shocking that America is a combination of religiously diverse, religiously devout, in an era of global religious conflict, and we're not killing each other in the streets. Okay, now we can do a lot better than killing each other in the streets, but the news from Baghdad, from Belfast, from Bombay, from Bosnia for a long time, it was in fact killing each other in the streets. And there is an American genius around this. There's an American power around this. And part of that power, as illustrated by a story Muhammad told earlier, is that we in the United States have spaces where people from different religious backgrounds meet and have positive interactions, like Wake Forest University, right? As stories that many of you sitting in that row told me earlier today, experiences of religious prejudice, where as the person got to know you, they viewed you differently and they viewed your entire religious community differently. That, I think, is a model America ought to hold up to the world, and something that President Obama talked about. We can model what it looks like for people from different religious backgrounds to come together and contribute to the common good of their nation. And actually, for a long time, a lot of countries were homogenous, relatively homogenous. Europe, relatively homogenous. Right? In large parts of the Middle East, relatively homogenous, or at least the group that was dominating so dominated that the other ethnic or religious group had so little say that it felt homogenous. It's not true anymore. One of the big challenges of Europe is, how is it going to integrate its Muslim minority? Big challenge in Syria, once the Assad regime does what the Assad regime ought to do, which is fall, is going to be how are Alawites and Sufis and Sunnis going to build a nation together? Big challenge in Lebanon for the past however many decades has been how are Christians and Sunnis and Shias and Druze going to build a nation together. On that count, America has a relatively good track record, and I think that we ought to be proud of it. I think that we ought to strengthen it. I think we ought to hold it up to the world, right? So that's the response to that. Response to your question. Watch Imam Griggs. Watch the grace in which he's walking. Think of the prophet walking under the balcony where the woman throws garbage on him, and the prophet's instinct is to worry about the woman's health when she doesn't show up in the balcony. Right? I mean, basically, be a Muslim. Right? Yeah, and it's not easy, but what we are required to do is to respond to that with grace. And part of the reason is because we believe that our grace will ultimately turn people. And over again, in Islamic history and in American history, it's been the case. And that's inspiring. And that doesn't mean it's easy. And that doesn't mean on a day-to-day basis it's not maddening. And it doesn't mean that I don't go through the roof a lot more than I ought to go through the roof, right? But here's the thing. Sirat al-Mustaqim is clear. The straight path on this is clear. The cycles of history on this are clear. How do you talk to the leader of a faith-based nonprofit organization that doesn't want to work with people of other religions? I think that's a challenging question. This is what I would call faith as a bubble. And I mean, frankly, it's not the worst thing in the world. There's a lot worse things that faith could be, right? And also, frankly, I have some admiration for that. I have a lot of admiration for that. Here's what I mean by that. I have admiration for people who say, listen, in a world that pluralizes and often secularizes, we have to have a place where we as Christians gather and just do a Christian thing. And this is that place, right? So I begin with a place of respect for that. And listen, you can, this is in the theologies of an awful lot of religious communities. You know, my son doesn't take communion at his Catholic school. Communion's for Catholics. Non-Muslims can't go to Mecca. Mecca is for Muslims. Non-Mormons can't go to the temple. The temple is for Mormons, right? I'm an Ismaili Muslim. Non-Ismailis can't come into our Jamaat Khanas. Jamaat Khanas are for Ismailis. I'm not saying I agree with each of these cases. I'm saying I find it moving that religious communities in a world that pluralizes say we have to have a space where we do our own thing. You know, that doesn't also mean that you shouldn't engage the person in a respectful conversation. And here is one way to have that conversation. And this is, I think, a bigger question of how complex faith is. I'll tell this to you in a very, very brief story. So my friend Scott Alexander is at Catholic Theological Union on the south side of Chicago. It's the largest Catholic seminary in America. And he's the professor of Catholic Muslim studies. And every year he has a meeting with the cardinal. And the cardinal begins the meeting with a question. Scott, you know that it is part of our doctrine to seek to convert Muslims. Yes, is what Scott says. And then the next 59 minutes and 30 seconds is about the various bridge building and appreciative knowledge programs that Scott is running. The cardinal just wants to be clear that Catholics want to do two things when it comes to Muslims: convert them and cooperate with them. And that's just the deal, right? Meaning both of those things are true. Now, F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the mark of an intelligent person is to be able to walk in the world with two competing ideas in their head and still be able to function. That's how religious traditions are. Religious traditions have competing ideas. One idea is you ought to, not every religion in this case, but at the very least Islam and Christianity, right? 2 billion people and 1.5 billion people. I seek to convert you. I seek to cooperate with you. The interesting question is not how are these things reconciled in some ethereal realm. It's how do these things play out in the real world? In other words, when do I, as a believing Muslim, feel that it is appropriate for me to have X conversation rather than Y conversation? The reason I think this might be helpful to your situation is perhaps you can articulate, look, I have great respect for your understanding of your religion as the full truth, as something that gives you a unique sense of life and purpose, as something that you want other people to come into. There is, in addition to that, an inspiration from Christianity to serve others and even to serve with others. And that comes through in a variety of stories, like there are sheep that are not of my flock, like the Good Samaritan story. And so what I'm wondering is if there is a space in your program where interfaith service can happen, recognizing that of the 100% of things you do, this might just be 1%. That's it. Right? And you're asking again respectfully, because they could say no. And again, that's not the worst thing in the world, right? They could have defined that space as entirely a space for their community, to do private things with their community, what Putnam would call bonded social capital. But I think it's worth the conversation, right? And it's worth you having the chance to articulate the multiple dimensions of a religion, the Great Commission dimension, and the good neighbor dimension, if you will, and how that other person understands it. Deep questions. Shall we take the last couple? And I'll try to be as quick as possible.
Okay. My name is Andrew Luisi, and I had a question written out earlier, but I'm going to change it right now. So, I had a question written earlier, but I'm just going to change it right now. So throughout this presentation and our earlier talks, it seems that there's this profound emphasis on the individual and personal relationships with the individual. And I can't help but think back to Martin Buber and his book, I and Thou. And he said it's very simple to have blind hatred when you're in this I and it relationship. He said it's very simple to have hatred towards this metaphorical enemy. But he said when you have this I and thou relationship, it's much more difficult to look into someone's eyes and say, I hate you, or I want to inflict this amount of pain on you. So I'd just like to know what your thoughts are, because on that.
Beautiful question. Thank you for that. So much fun. I spent half the day with most of you. That was great. Thank you for that.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Leticia DiVenuto, and my question is, I'll start with a story. I have a really good friend who was applying to the Peace Corps. She thought that that was her plan after graduation. She was really excited about it until she found that in the Peace Corps you cannot mention anything about your faith when you are working with the Peace Corps. And it was disheartening for her because obviously her faith meant more to her than her nationality, it meant more to her than her race, and it meant more to her than her political affiliations. So my question would just sort of be, how would you reconcile this with the government and other institutions that have similar policies?
Melissa, help me. I'll answer your question, but you ought to talk to her afterwards. I'm going to keep sending people your way.
My name is Zach Bales. I'm a third-year divinity student. And as you brought up Rhode Island, there is Roger Williams, of course, the author of The Bloody Tenet of Persecution for Cause of Conscience, in which he argued that no person, regardless of their conscience, should ever die, and never should it be done under the name of the Prince of Peace. And so as that identity and that heritage gets formed into the Constitution of the United States, and we find ourselves now in the 21st century in a battle in the courts over Sharia law and the legality of it, my question is of a man who had a dream a long time ago to inspire people to be able to come to a place and explore religious liberty and freedom of conscience. Today we have reached a place where that is difficult in some areas. And so I would like to see what your thoughts are on how the work of interfaith can inspire greater work of religious liberty, not only here but abroad, and how religious liberty also helps foster the work of interfaith work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to take this backwards, and somebody is going to correct me on this, I know, because I'm only going to get this half right. But I think it was Madison who said that I think it's Madison through Voltaire, or actually. When you have one religion in a country, am I getting this right? When you have one religion in a country, it does what one religion always does, it dominates. When you have two religions in a country, they do what two religions always do, they fight. When you have 30 religions in a country, they have to learn how to get along. And they have to articulate principles of that getting along. So what's interesting is in colonial America is you actually had a number of different sects present, right? So you had Baptists and Quakers, you had Jews, you had Catholics, and at least in this reading, one of the reasons for the articulation of religious liberty in America was precisely because of the plurality of religion. So one of the things they had to figure out was, well, how are you going to be you and us going to be us? Now, there's probably different versions of this, and as I said, I'm probably getting this less than, am I getting a C on this at least, Melissa? She didn't give me a grade, which is disappointing. I know what that means. So I think there is definitely a relationship between freedom of religion, as it was articulated, and the fact that there were many religions present in colonial America. There's no doubt about that, right? And clearly there was a relationship between the experience of Europe at the time and state-dominated churches, et cetera, and people wanting to escape from that, and all sorts of things. Here's something that's interesting. There are other countries that would say they have religious liberty that also don't have separation of church and state. I will tell you a funny story. Queen Elizabeth, when she is in London, is part of the Church of England. She's an Anglican. But when she is in Edinburgh, in Scotland, you know what she is? She's part of the Church of Scotland. She is a Presbyterian. Right? England is a country of religious freedom. You can pray in whatever language you want. You can build your church, mosque, synagogue. It has an established church. Germany has two, the Lutheran Church and the Catholic Church. There are conceivably multiple ways to create a society of religious freedom that is not based on a separation of church and state. I am now deep in waters that I don't know well. I'm going to shut up and pull back, only to say that there is an interesting relationship. The American example is probably only one example, and probably useful to think about as all these countries in the Middle East are figuring out who they're going to be. All of these nations are nations with the soul of a mosque, if you will, right? And there might be other models that are useful. What's, I think, 100% useful about the American experiment is that people from different religions ought to build a nation together. What the exact political system around that is, what the exact church-state relationship, I'm not 100% sure. I'm going to say one final thing on this, which is this was achieved, no doubt in my mind, as an ideal in America. It was also achieved as part of a practicality. Now I'm getting into President Hatch's territory here, but George Washington, when he heard about the Continental Army having Pope Day celebrations, celebration is a terrible word to use here, you know what that is? Burning effigies of the Pope. He was livid because he's like, we're trying to build an army to defeat the British, and you are going to openly insult the Catholics from Maryland? We actually want them to be part of the army. And we would really like if French Catholic Canada didn't invade on behalf of the British. So why don't you not insult the Catholics, please, right? This is actually, I think, a beautiful part of the American experiment, which is this realization that, wait a second, if we're going to build a nation, all of these different communities are going to have to work together, and the Continental Army is probably the first national institution in which that has to happen. Zero doubt in my mind that that informs Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation of Newport, Rhode Island, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Terrific question. Relates to Letitia, right? Letitia's question. What a question. So when Melissa and I were first appointed to the President's Faith Council, our friend Joshua, in one of his first speeches to us, the director of the President's Faith Office was, let me tell you what words I never want to read in the newspaper. The People versus Joshua Dubois. Right? Do not get me sued. Do not cross the church-state line. Do not do things that would seem, and that office was mostly domestic, right? But do not do things that would seem as if the United States government is promoting a particular religion, which is really what the Establishment Clause is about, right? And my sense is that the Peace Corps, which has been doing this for 50 years, and I think it actually starts in a Muslim country. Am I right? I think it starts in Morocco or something like that. Part of the deal that they had to make with those governments was Americans who come under color of the Peace Corps cannot even give the hint of evangelism, right? I 100% understand the frustration of your friend. I find it actually, I think it would be terrific if religiously diverse groups of Americans were able to go abroad and serve together and articulate their faiths and be a model of how people from different religions work together to serve others. I think that by a hair, I would side with the Peace Corps on this, because I think that the danger of even giving the patina of the American government through the Peace Corps as a Trojan horse of evangelism is the cost is just too high. So what I would tell your friend, and unfortunately we live in a world of choices in this way, I would tell your friend she should probably do another program. In other words, I would tell your friend, don't give up the thing that inspires you. If that's what inspires you, you got to do that, right? But probably then the Peace Corps isn't the right program for you. Now, the wonderful thing is there's a bunch of other programs, right? I mean, the Interfaith Youth Core worked with the Tony Blair Faith Foundation on something called the Faith Act Fellowship, which is precisely about young people young college graduates from different religions doing international work together, articulating their faith inspiration. And there's probably a ton of other things as well. That's what I would suggest. In a way, I don't want to say it. I wish we could have our cake and eat it too. I don't think in this case. I don't think it would be fair to your friend to say, you got to be quiet about this, even though I think for the purpose of the Peace Corps, they have to ask people not to do it. Final question. No doubt, I love it, I and thou. I want to say a couple of very, very quick things about that. One is, yes, I've talked a lot about individuals, and maybe I emphasize that too much, because actually one of the powerful things about working in the world of faith is it's about communities, which is, talk to Mustafa about that, right? Like what he does is he organizes, that's what Barack was doing in the 1980s in Chicago. The fact is, religious communities are convening points for an awful lot of people of goodwill who want to serve others, which is precisely why they're so useful and powerful to organize and bring together. So that's part one. I don't think we ought to just be talking about individuals here. On the I and thou piece, I think I and thou happens in two ways, right? And one way is in that personal interaction. I mean, pull Muhammad aside later. Were you in the session with the Muslim students? Yeah, okay. So you heard his story of the basketball court in the mosque, right? I mean, what a ridiculous story, right? This group of kids that to make a long and beautiful story very short, comes and throws stones at a mosque that Muhammad is in as a kid. So Muhammad is like 9 years old or whatever, looking out the second-story window, watching a group of kids from the neighborhood stop and say, "You Muslim terrorists," and throw mosques at the window. And then Muhammad, scared out of his mind, walks out in a shalvar kameez, and one of the kids looks at him and says, "I know you." And Muhammad says, "Yeah, we played ball together all day yesterday." And that kid says to his friends, "Stop." Right? That's I and thou. When you have situations where people from different backgrounds get to meet like that, basketball courts, universities, YMCAs, you get thou. But there's a second way to have thou. I think there's a theology of thou. You see what I'm saying? In other words, I might not have ever met somebody from a particular religion, but I know that person isn't an it. You want to know why? Because I'm a Muslim. And my theology says that God gave that person his breath. That God made that person his Abd and Khalifa. All of us, all children of Adam, right? So this is part of the power of a theology of interfaith cooperation. It's the prism through which we look at our religion upon religious diversity, and we sacralize that diversity. And I don't ever have to have met you to feel like you are a thou if I'm looking at you through a Muslim lens. Thanks.
Eboo Patel, you are a magnificent teacher, a wonderful answerer of questions. You've been inspiring and challenging, and you've helped us see with new eyes. Join me in thanking him again. Thank you and good evening.